This video lecture is on an introduction to poetry, both reading and analysis. Poetry is like music. It has lyrical qualities and is often meant to be read aloud. Sarah Kay is a poet who began writing poetry when she was 14 years old. She became successful at a young age, presented a TED Talk in 2011, and founded Project Voice, which is a group of poets who not only perform their poems, but also conduct workshops at schools and perform for students. Sarah Kay communicates clearly how poetry can capture the human experience. In her TED Talk, Sarah Kay discusses how reading opens up other people's experiences to her, and how she uses poetry to communicate her life experience to her readers. Towards the end of the TED Talk, she says, "We have both learned the art of capture." What she is talking about is a comparison between the poetry that she writes and the photographs that her father takes. A photograph captures a specific moment in time or a specific experience. So does a poem. Each one captures an aspect of the human experience, whether it's loss, love, joy, desire, or pain. Billy Collins' Introduction to Poetry is a poem that captures a specific aspect of the human experience. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin by beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. Reading this poem from the perspective of a teacher, this poem captures the struggle to get students to slow down and appreciate a poem's language. Many times readers become frustrated with poetry. They don't understand the language or it's too abstract. They want to beat it with a hose to figure out what it really means, because the meaning isn't always evident upon the first read. However, that's also the beauty of poetry. It's slowing down, it's looking for the powerful language, and it's trying to figure out what aspect of the human experience each poem is capturing. Here are some questions I would like for you to consider as you're reading poetry. First, what do you like about the poem? Second, what aspect of the human experience does this poem reveal? Third, what are the powerful lines or words in the poem? And finally, what is the value of this poem? Why would another reader benefit from reading this poem? Walt Whitman's poem, When I Heard the Learned Astronomer, also captures a very specific aspect of the human experience. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I sitting heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon unaccountable I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. This poem is told from the perspective of a student who is sitting in a lecture and becomes tired and bored. Many of us have been in this exact situation before. What the poem reveals through its lines is the science of astronomy versus the beauty of the stars. It is clear that the lecturer is educated, he or she is learned, and it's also clear that he or she is celebrated because of the applause in the lecture room. However, the education and the information being presented to the speaker is not enough to keep the speaker engaged. Instead, we have the speaker either drifting off into a dream or possibly actually walking outside and going to appreciate the beauty of the stars individually rather than in a classroom where somebody is speaking about the science of astronomy. This poem captures an aspect of the human experience about learning. While it's clear that the speaker could learn a great deal from the astronomer who's lecturing, it's just as clear that the speaker is gaining an appreciation of the beauty of astronomy by studying the stars independently. Edwin Arlington Robinson's poem Richard Cory describes the experience of townspeople who are admiring a man named Richard Cory who lives in their town. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, we people on the pavement looked at him. He was a gentleman from sole to crown, clean-favored and imperially slim. And he was always quietly arrayed, and he was always human when he talked. But still he fluttered pulses when he said, "Good morning," and he glittered when he walked. And he was rich, yes, richer than a king, and admirably schooled in every grace. In fine, we thought that he was everything, to make us wish that we were in his place. So on we worked and waited for the light, and went without the meat and cursed the bread. And Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home and put a bullet through his head. The aspect of human experience that Richard Cory captures is envy. The poem communicates that appearances are not always what they seem. Now the question is how the poem communicates that message. What we're going to talk about is formal analysis, a process called poetic context. We begin with the speaker of the poem. The speaker is not necessarily the author. When we're reading a novel, we never assume that the character is the author, himself or herself, and the same goes for a poem. We cannot assume that the speaker in the poem is necessarily the poet. So the question becomes, who is the person or object speaking to the reader through the poem? In Richard Cory, the pronoun we is used, so we know that it is a collective group of people, it's not just one person. And it says, we people on the pavement looked at him, and this is happening while they're downtown. As we continue through the poem, we know that these people look at Richard Cory and that they're not very wealthy. They work, they wait for the light, they go without the meat, which is more expensive food, and they curse the bread, which is all they can afford to eat. And they see Richard Cory as this idol. The we is what communicates that it's a group of people, but then the details in the poem, in specific lines of the poem, communicate the speaker that we're dealing with in this poem. Situation is the next step in the poetic context analysis. What is happening in each stanza of the poem? Don't analyze here, just translate it and put it in your words. In the first stanza, we know that Richard Cory goes downtown and the townspeople look at him. We know that they consider him a gentleman. In the second stanza, they describe Richard Cory. They say that he's always human, which seems to communicate that he's down to earth, but he also seems to make people nervous because they get excited to see him or when he speaks to them. In the third stanza, the speaker emphasizes how rich Richard Cory is and how he's very educated. They also communicate that they think of him as everything and that they also wish that they could be in his place. In the final stanza, they describe how they don't have much wealth. They talk about working and waiting for the light and then only being able to eat bread. And in the last two lines of the poem, we learn that Richard Cory takes his own life. While the situation in Richard Cory is pretty easy to figure out, this step of the process of the analysis comes in handy when you're dealing with a very complex poem. If the language is difficult or if the poem is very abstract, it's very helpful to break it down by stanza and actually interpret what the poet is saying. The final step in the poetic context analysis is the actual analysis itself. In this part of the analysis, you need to ask what devices are present in the poem. By devices, we're talking about poetic devices. So you can look for sound devices like onomatopoeia or alliteration. You can look for figurative language like metaphors and similes. You can also look for descriptive language like imagery. You have a handout with the literary elements outlined with definitions and examples. So that is the handout that you need to refer to as you're analyzing poetry. The second question is what meaning is created by each device. So we look at what devices are there, and then we ask how they're creating meaning in the poem. One device that's very present throughout Richard Cory is imagery. The speaker spends a great deal of time describing him. In the first stanza, he's called a gentleman from sole to crown, clean-favored and imperially slim. The language that is used here invokes the sense of royalty. from soul to crown. Instead of saying from toe to head, the speaker uses the word crown, which makes us think of royalty, like a king or a queen. The word imperial is also about royalty. And so the language here is showing us that he's exalted, that he's treated like somebody who is a king. In the second stanza, one of the descriptions that used is glittered. He glittered when he walked. And this is important because he doesn't just walk like a normal person. He almost seems to shine as he walks down the street. And Fluttered Pulses communicates that idea that he makes people nervous or excited when they see him. The imagery used in the first three stanzas emphasizes how highly the townspeople regard Richard Cory. They look up to him, they idolize him, they wish that they could be him. And so the final two lines of the poem really communicate this message. In the final two lines of the poem, we have situational irony. And this is the poetic device when we have a situation that is the opposite of what the audience or the reader would expect. And Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home and put a bullet through his head. So here we have this person who the townspeople idolize, and yet it is clear from these final two lines of the poem that he does not enjoy his life, that he's willing to take his own life because of his unhappiness. And so even though the townspeople see him as the person having the perfect life, it becomes very clear in those final two lines that that's not the case at all. And so through the imagery and through the situational irony, we understand the aspect of the human experience of envy, and we also understand the message that appearances are not always what they seem, that appearances can be deceiving. Going through the steps of the poetic context analysis will help you navigate poetry, will help you figure out who the speaker is, the situation in the poem, and then also what poetic devices are present in communicating that message of significance. For the poetry challenge and discussion, what I want you to look for is any poem in the textbook that you enjoy. There are specific questions that you need to answer for this discussion, but what we're doing is we're looking for poetry that has powerful language, that communicates an aspect of the human experience that we can identify with and that we can share with each other.